Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. Well, hello. Welcome to what is usually where I film my vlog clips. I didn't vlog for about a week and a half. Let's go ahead and talk about the books that I've read because I have read some that were very interesting and that I have some thoughts about. So we're gonna go ahead and just talk briefly about the books that I've read during the last week and a half. I think, let's see, how many books did I read? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so I read 6 books and they were all pretty much audiobooks. I was kind of going on a little bit of a Pam Godwin bender. I was on a live show with Jen from the Book Refuge. She hosted it there. We got to interview Pam and had a really good discussion. It was wonderful. I'll have that video, that live, linked down below if you want to go check it out because it was honestly just so fascinating and I loved getting to chat with her. So prior to that, I was trying to read as many of her books as possible so I would be able to like talk to her about them, you know? And so I started with her Deliver series. Well, I didn't start. I'd read other books by Pam. Anyway, this was what I was currently reading right before we had the live show, and I had just finished Disclaim. So this is a 9-book series, and it is all about, this is dark romance. Like, this is extremely dark with all kinds of trigger warnings for sure. These are basically sex trafficking. Some of them are sex slaves. Some of them are freed and they're back in the world trying to get more slaves freed and things like that. This is like, this series literally holds nothing back. Like, it goes to very dark places. It goes to really ugly crimes that are committed. And the thing that I find really fascinating about this specifically is how it makes us question what is right and what is wrong when you have to consider, like, how are these people living? How are they surviving? They have to make some very difficult choices and do some things that are like the less of 2 really bad, evil things to survive and to keep their loved ones alive. So I had already talked about Deliver, so we're going to talk about Vanquish. So the books I read in this series are 3. I read Vanquish, Disclaim, and then I also read Devastate. So this is the bind-up of the first 3. It's a beautiful hardcover. I think it's honestly so stunning. I just loved it and I had to have it, but I listened to these on audio. The audiobooks are really great, and you can actually buy they're only on Audible, I think, but you can buy the bind-up of 3 audiobooks, which is like 30 hours for 1 credit, which is like such a good deal. So that's how I listened to those. So we're going to talk about Vanquish first. So Vanquish, so it's kind of hard to talk about these books because they do each sort of run into each other. They don't run into each other, but they have, basically what happens is you have characters in each book that you meet in the first book, which is Deliver. Deliver is the first book, and that's what sets up the whole world. That's where we meet Liv and Van, and they are basically sex traffickers, and they are out there trying to capture people to sell them in this market and train them, and it is extremely dark. But I was completely riveted with this story. I was absolutely hooked. Like, I could not put any of these books down. Well, one was a little bit not as riveting for me, but we'll get that to the point. So Vanquish takes Van, who we meet in book 1. He is actually the sex trafficker. He is making the deals. He has helped training them, and he is out to try and find Liv, who has escaped from him. And so he ends up tracking her down and finding her and Josh, but he finds this other woman who lives next door to them as he is trying to find them. And he is immediately intrigued with her. For one, because she is exceptionally beautiful. She has a completely seductive figure. She is a former fitness model and beauty pageant winner. But he notices something kind of strange about her in that she won't leave her house. Like, she won't even go to get the mail. Like, she does a lot of rituals and things like that. So she is an agoraphobic and she won't leave her house. So she has had an extremely emotionally abusive relationship with her husband, who she's no longer married to. And it is because of her husband's abuse and her OCD disorder, or her OCD and her personality, they sort of combine into this really very flawed, very hurt, trying to keep herself safe and live in a world where she doesn't feel safe at all, and she's trying to protect her emotional and her physical safety. And so she does a lot of kind of things that we might think are strange to try and stay safe in that way. And Van is just really struck with her. So he ends up thinking that he is going to kidnap her and sell her as a sex slave. So this entire book takes place basically in Van's apartment, because he does end up kidnapping her and taking her to his place. There is definitely a component of pretty much all of these books that has some type of force and really zero consent at certain points in the romantic relationship. And that is kind of a hallmark to what makes these so dark, other than the obvious subject matter of sex trafficking. But the thing that was extremely, extremely fascinating about this book, and that I just absolutely loved and adored. So this is still, at this point, I have read 4 of these books. This one is my favorite by far. It was utterly fascinating, but it was also very haunting, and it was very uncomfortable. And I think that that is something that I'm really, really loving and interested in Pam's books, is how she gets you to feel so many uncomfortable things, to get you to feel almost like disgust and revulsion and things that make you very uncomfortable, things that make you think you would never in a million years root for this villain. Because not each of them, but either hero or heroine in this series, they're almost always villain. They're extremely morally gray. They do bad things, and sometimes they do bad things to protect people, and sometimes they do bad things just to do bad things, because there's a lot of different power dynamics that are at play here too. There's a lot of talk about submissives and dominance, and it's just honestly riveting and compelling. But I will say, if those are things that you don't enjoy reading about, this series is definitely not for you, because there is straight up zero consent at times, but it does between the love interests. So if that's a hard pass for you, don't read these any further. Don't pick these up. And in the past for me, that has been a very hard line that I don't want to cross. But there's something about Pam's books that keeps me thinking, okay, she had the hero do this despicable act to the heroine. How is she going to get me on board with him? And I'm going to tell you not exactly how she does that, but inevitably, in almost every single book of hers that I have read, there's that moment where it changes, and I get on board with that hero to be with the heroine. And it's just honestly incredible to me that Pam is able to do that in fiction and make something that is so ugly just so compelling. There is there's something in Vanquish that is really quite odd and unsettling. Van has this history of, from the time he was a little boy, he has a very complicated backstory and a really tragic childhood, things that have set his entire life in motion for who he is today. And there is something that he does that harkens back to his childhood that is a little off-putting, and it's that he builds dolls to look like the women in his life that he has loved or that he has connected with. And as soon as that scene was in there, I was like, ugh, And then that inevitable thing happened with Pam, where she was able to get me on board with that. And not necessarily on board with that, but she allowed me to see why he did this. And that it wasn't a gross thing, it wasn't creepy, but it made him and that hobby that he had, it made it endearing. And I was just it was at that moment where I was like, what power this writer has, it was completely mind-blowing for me. So eventually this book does end up with the hero and heroine getting together after quite a lot of difficulty that they have, and it's just completely compelling watching these two, who were essentially opposites and who didn't want to be together to then really develop this powerful love and relationship. Like, it was honestly incredible. I can see how these books are not going to be for everyone, but for me, they were absolutely fascinating, incredibly fast-paced. They read a lot like a thriller, horror, and a romance, and they're just completely satisfying. I really, really enjoyed it. So that one was 5 stars. It's my favorite in the series. I truly freaking loved it. It was fantastic. Okay, but I will say, after I read that book, I definitely needed something a little more lighthearted, and I needed to read this for the Rake Appreciation Society live show. I had already read this, but I had the audio too, and I wanted to have a really happy, light audiobook that I knew I was going to love and that was just going to be romantic, and so I picked up Devil in Disguise. The audio was great. I loved it. 6-star read for me again. This is just, I just love this book so much. It's so heartwarming. I feel like the romance is just one of the most perfect romances that I have ever read. I loved seeing St. Vincent again and Evie. I loved Marcus and Lillian. Like, it was just a beautiful, beautiful romance, and it really felt a bit like a love letter to fans, like in the way that you have so many back characters from both the Wallflowers and the Ravenels here, but at the same time, Merritt and Kyr's love story takes center stage, and it's just beautiful. So we do have a live show discussion on my channel for this book. It's about an hour long. I loved it. 5 stars. Definitely worth the reread. Okay, so then the next book that I picked up is Disclaim, and this is book 3 in the Deliver series. This book follows 2 other characters. Now, most of these books further on in the series, after 1 and 2, you are reading the stories of slaves who were freed in the first book, sex slaves who were freed in the first book. So this one follows Camilla, who was a sex slave. She's now freed, and she's basically going out to try and make sure that other slaves are freed as well. And this book had some of the most gory torture scenes that I have ever read that were a little bit shocking, but also was just like added that dark and gritty layer to this dark romance that just made me like enthralled, you know, like I was just riveted by this story. So Camilla is a bit of a vigilante, like she's going out there to bring all of these sex slave traffickers down, and as she does that, she ends up meeting back up with Matthias, who is basically her childhood sweetheart. Like, they were friends as children, they developed feelings as children, deep feelings of love, but then she is kidnapped by sex traffickers and taken away, and Matthias ends up basically going into the darker side, that selling sex slaves side of that as well. So when they meet up, Camilla is determined that she is never going to be a sex slave again. However, she does end up getting captured, and it is by Matthias. So this book was a tough read, honestly. Like, there were some scenes in here between the hero and heroine that honestly felt irredeemable to me at some point, and I was like, I don't know. And the whole time I was reading this, Jen from the Book Refuge, my dear bestie Jen, she kept saying, now you have to trust Pam, okay? This book is going to be hard, so trust Pam. And so I did, knowing at some point I was going to understand why that happened and sort of see the reasoning behind it, and it was all going to make sense, because that's something that Pam does in these books really well, is she gets you to see that she truly has a plan for everything, and things that you think are just maybe gratuitous are never. Like, everything has a purpose in here, and it is very clever. Honestly, these books are brilliant. I feel like they're just incredible. When we talked with Pam on Jen's channel, she told us that she loves horror books, and she has training as a writer in thrillers, so that's how she plots her books. And that's interesting to me, because when I was talking to her about the books on Jen's channel, I said, these read like thrillers, and she's like, they are. They're thrillers and they're romance, and I'm like, that's exactly what it is. So you have the thriller horror aspect of it that doesn't hold any punches back, that takes you dark, grisly areas, but you also have like the components of romance. So you have like steam, like high level steam, and you also end up with a happily ever after. You know, each of these books has a happily ever after, and I for one found that incredibly fulfilling and enjoyable. I loved that so much, because there's something at the end of each of these books that talks about how dark these characters' lives had to go. Like, there's always a few lines, and how now they're able to see, like, the beauty in their life again and not just be shackled by chains, and it's just beautiful. I loved it so much. And this book specifically goes to some really dark, dark places. I think each book in this series that I have read so far gets darker and darker and darker. And if you read the first book and you're like, it gets darker than this, like, it does, I promise you. But you also have those flickers of hope, you have those glimmers of light, and you ultimately have that happily ever after in the end. So this book was a 4 out of 5 stars for me, and part of that is largely because the heroine placed such a huge amount of trust in the hero. A huge amount of trust in the hero after he does some extremely despicable things to her. And I felt like her trust was based on what had on the boy she knew growing up. But that's never shown to the reader. You don't have those scenes from their childhood or when they're meeting so that you can see and feel the love they have for one another. The only thing that you really have is them reminiscing on it. And so that made me not really believe how she trusted him so deeply, because it wasn't shown to me, it was just talked about. And so it kind of didn't feel as fulfilling as the previous 2 books had. So I did end up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. It was extremely dark. It was at times unpleasant to read. The Happily Ever After was really fulfilling though, and it was still just a really intriguing, interesting character study and journey into this dark place and out. It was fascinating, honestly. I will say that these dark romance books don't give me, and I've mentioned this in my vlogs, they don't give me happy, swoony feels for the most part. There are times that they do, but a lot of what is so compelling about these books is that juxtaposition of the darkness with the light, you know? Like, Pam does this really well, where she will take some really dark topics like pain, and she'll contrast that almost immediately with pleasure. So you have those two opposing forces like right next to each other, but it never feels like flip-floppy. It always feels like a natural progression. And she does the same with tenderness and violence and force and choice, you know, all of those things where you have the opposite one next to another. She just weaves those throughout her stories, and it's awesome, honestly. Fantastic, really great. Okay. So after that book, I went right on into Devastate, which is book 4 in this series. And this book follows Tate, who we have seen in the previous book. He was best friends with Camilla, and he is on a mission to go and try and find Camilla's sister, who was also kidnapped, and rescued her. But Camilla and most people believe that she is dead because no one has seen or heard from her in over 10 years. So he, however, has deep feelings for Camilla, and so he feels like this is a way that he can kind of feel close to her again. So he actually does end up finding Camilla's sister, who is the heroine in this book, and when he finds her, he sort of becomes borderline obsessed with her and starts following her and trying to figure out a way to get her freed. And the interesting thing about Lucia, Camilla's sister, so Lucia is the heroine in this book, is that she, you know, Tate believes her to be a sex slave, but come to find out she actually is the one who is doing a lot of like sexual torture to people, and she's a main force in moving the sex trafficking in this world, this community. So that was a little bit shocking for him, but of course nothing is as it seems on the surface in these books. So this book was a freaking ride. There were some truly heartbreaking scenes in here featuring Van from book 2, who is my favorite hero of the series. I freaking love him. He is the ultimate villain hero. Like, his redemption arc is so satisfying. If you love a villain with a great redemption arc, like, his story is fantastic. But there was a scene in here that was completely heartbreaking, and it involves Van. This book goes again to some extremely dark places, but it does rise up out of that and ends up with a happily ever after. And I did enjoy this book. I did give it 4 out of 5 stars. And that's largely because of, I in the first 2 books, I felt such a connection with the hero and the heroine, even though they're sort of like opposing forces and there's that dynamic of captor and captive. You could truly feel the connection between them. And that felt a little bit less for me in book 3 for the reason that I talked about. And in book 4, it didn't feel like I didn't get their connection as well in book 4 as I had in the first 2 books. And I think that is largely because of, you know, Tate's motives for going to find her were based upon his feelings for Camilla. And so it just seemed like she was trying to be a replacement for Camilla, Lucia was, and it didn't feel like love to me. So that was why I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't feel like their love was as believable as the other books in the series had been. This was still just completely fascinating, and I really, really loved seeing characters from other books that I loved and adored, and so 4 out of 5 stars for this one. This one is not my favorite in the series, but it was still an interesting and a good read. So, now, 2 more books to talk about. Okay, so after I read those dark romances, I went to a reread, and that's interesting because I've said before I'm not a huge rereader, and that is very true, but I am finding that after I finish these very dark reads, even though I am enjoying them, they are incredibly fascinating, very fast-paced, like I'm hooked. I want something lighter, something more comforting, something that I know I'm gonna love, and so what I'm turning to is my historicals that I've read and loved, so like Devil in Disguise. And then I had a hankering to reread this. I have read this. I read this last year, early. I read this before I even had a channel, and this is The Hunter. This is book 2 in the Victorian Rebel series by Kerrigan Byrne. When I initially read this book, I had just barely gotten back into historical romances again. It had been several years since I had read any, and so one of the first books that I read, it was The Duchess of Steel, and then I went into The Highwayman, and I just freaking fell in love with The Highwayman, and so then of course I had to read the next one, and I gave it 5 stars. I just loved it so much. So this time I listened to the audio, which is fantastic by the way, and my bookmark is still in there. I ended up giving it 5 stars again. I just love this book. I love Kerrigan's writing. This is probably not a favorite of mine. The Highwayman is probably my ultimate favorite just because of the feelings that I had when I read it for the first time. But this one is just still so good. Like, I also wanted to pick up a dark historical just because I've been reading all of these dark romances lately. I've found a new appreciation for that subgenre and just been really fascinated and loving that reading experience. And I wanted to see what my thoughts were on a dark historical, and the only author that I feel like does it to perfection for me is Kerrigan Byrne. Elizabeth Hoyt does have some darker historical romances, but not quite to this level, and this, on a dark romance scale, is like a 1 compared to a 10 from the Pam Godwin books I'm just at, so it's much, much, much lighter than what I had been reading right before this, but it's still dark for a historical. So this book is basically about an assassin, Christopher Argent, who takes a job to murder a woman who is this actress. She is acting in these Shakespearean plays. She's extremely well known. She's a beautiful woman, and she has a little boy. Now, Christopher Argent has some very traumatic things happen in his childhood where his mother is sexually assaulted before his eyes and killed, and he is traumatized and just wrecked from that. So he ends up taking this job to kill this woman, and they're like, you can kill the kid too if he's in the way, and he's like, I don't kill children. And it's just honestly so great. So of course, as he hunts her down, he is incredibly attracted to her and ends up falling in love with her instead of killing her. So this book is just, it's just so great. I love Kerrigan Byrne. I love this series so much. I've only read the first 3 books, so now I need to go through and finish the rest of them. But this book was just so good. It hit everything I was looking for in a dark historical. It was sexy, it was dark, there were parts of this that were funny. It was just such a great read. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm so glad that I reread it because I remembered the main plot beats of this, but also there was a lot that I had forgotten or that I hadn't really appreciated the first time, so it was really fun to go back and reread this, and it was a 5-star read for me again. Loved it. Okay, and the last book that I have to talk to you about is actually an ARC that I read, and it's I'm Only Wicked With You by Julie Anne Long. Now, I have never read Julie Anne Long. This book actually released August 24th. I received an ARC of this from NetGalley, and I read it, and I gave this book 4 stars, but I think it's a 4-star read. It was fun. It was enjoyable. I really was impressed with this author's writing style. I'd never read her before. She has a really interesting way of writing that feels like she is giving you these little tiny details, these little nuggets of information about the characters while also building the relationship right up alongside that. And it's sort of subtly done, which I really enjoy reading about. It's not just in your face, it's not just thrown at you. And I do feel like a lot of the arcs that I have read this year that are historicals, that aren't by authors that I know and love, have felt like too obvious for me, you know, like they're just kind of hitting you with this super snappy idea and it's not developed well enough for me. So this was a really pleasant surprise. I kind of fell in love with her writing style. I thought it was beautiful. It was very clever. It had a lot of subtlety and nuance to it, and I really, really loved that. And it felt very much like a slow burn. Like there's a lot of buildup in these characters before anything really romantic happens. This is basically about an American who's trying to build basically a financial empire, and our heroine is a British society lady who is kind of known for not necessarily causing trouble, but she's basically she kind of comes across as a little bit of a spoiled rich girl, you know what I mean? But like I said, like the writing style worked for me so well because there were those moments that felt like gave you a little bit of insight to, yeah, on the surface, she's showing you that she's this spoiled rich girl and she, you know, she's kind of a brat, but then there would be something that would show a little bit of vulnerability and a little bit of insight into her personality, and I really enjoyed that. So this wasn't a 5-star read, but it was still a really solid read, and it made me want to pick up more of this author's work because I definitely enjoyed it. So the only thing I think that would detract from it is that it took a little bit of time for things to get going, and there were some slow parts, but other than that, it was good. I really liked it. So 4 out of 5 stars for that one. Okay, so I had a really good week and a half or so of reading, and I just kind of wanted to talk about these books to you guys in sort of a casual setting. I got a drink made, but I didn't drink it. Sort of like a vlog, and just kind of go over things that I've been reading and my thoughts and feelings. So yeah, I hope you liked this little casual video, and let me know what you have been reading since we have chatted last, and if you've made it to the end, please feel free to leave me any color of heart. I would love that. Thank you so much, my friends, for watching. I'll see you in my next video.